Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Upleveling Leadership Preparation and Development. This is part 2, and I am Dr. Vernita Glenn White. Thank you for joining me again on this series. And if you are new and did not get a chance to go listen to part 1, we are really talking about components of my dissertation that I started almost a decade ago. And I'm realizing that it's still relevant today, especially with the push towards more STEM education, STEM professions, and things like that. As I mentioned before, I believe that there's a missing component to the entire movement of developing more STEM capacity. And if you're unfamiliar with STEM, it is science, technology, engineering, mathematics. It is not a new concept, but it has become a buzzword and now like an entire movement. But I believe that there's a missing component. As I said before, there's a lot of development for students. There is a lot of training and preparation for teachers, honestly, maybe not to the level or the quality that there needs to be, but it is still there available for them. And then when you get for the students who are going into college or alternative pathways to learning, there are professionals who are teaching them in that capacity, a lot of on-the-job training once they get into the fields and things like that. However, the component that is missing from my perspective and from research, hence why I am going back and reading through some components of this research study to show you that leaders, people who are responsible for making decisions for student achievement, student success, building teacher capacity, and all of those things from the K-12 level all the way up to the national level, honestly, it has not been a lot of training, research, or study around building that STEM knowledge and capacity in the leaders. So that is a brief update from part 1. Part 2, we're going to get more into the background and the research. And some people a lot of people like to read over or skip these parts and go to the practical solutions. And I'm all for practical solutions. However, I believe that what is happening in the traditional education system from K-12 to higher ed in most cases, especially in the preparation and development and training areas, that people are taking bits and pieces of solutions, I would say, and not understanding how they were developed or what they were designed for, or taking them out of context. So I'm providing a lot of context in this part 2. And again, I want to give you more background. Now, I did say that my study focused on mathematics. However, you will probably hear me say insert the concept of STEM education here or engineering design as we move forward, because this was almost a decade ago. It wrapped up in 2015, but I did start this in 2012 when I first went to graduate school at my doctoral program. However, I've been in education, I want to say all my life, but definitely I've been educating for over 20 years. And it's been over 15 where I've actually made it a career, when I say over 20 years, because I've been teaching and coaching and leading people in various areas, especially since high school. So this has been a true path for me. And I do value this skill set and this profession. And I believe it is my responsibility to share my piece of the solution with those who are willing to be open about it and moving forward. But all of that to say is the mathematics is just the one lane that I focus on. However, it can be anything that's in science, technology, engineering, design as a whole, and mathematics. And truth be told, this research came from doing studies on reading, writing, and psychology. So it's not just for the fields that I mentioned, it's for any field, but because of my lane, I stick to my lane and we're in this path. All right, so we're going to get started. So I'll read some background, which is an introduction to this part. It says the purpose of the study was to understand what administrators attend to during instruction and how what they notice influence their ability to identify the Common Core state standards for mathematical practice. Now, I'll try not to do too many inserts, but Common Core state standards, that was the those were the main curriculum part, I would say. At the time I was doing the study, there have been states that do not utilize the Common Core state standards, even though they do, they just don't use the name for it. And then for my international people, it will be whatever your government or local or whatever your framework for educating children. So we'll say that. So whenever you hear Common Core, please don't get turned off by that. Just insert whatever your standards are. Also important was to understand how their knowledge of instructional leadership, content, and students influence their vision of mathematics instruction during classroom observations. Administrators require a level of content expertise to ensure that teachers are teaching at a level of academic rigor that supports student achievement. The Common Core State Standards for Mathematics has shifted the way teachers teach and how students think about mathematics. Administrators need to understand this shift as they evaluate and observe mathematics classrooms. In this section, I discuss the various reforms that have occurred in mathematics education and how they led to the development of the Common Core State Standards for Mathematics and the standards for mathematical practice they contain. I next discuss the role of administrators through a review of the instructional leadership literature pertaining to administrators' involvement in mathematics, followed by the details of the conceptual framework. Finally, the research methods used to understand the intersection of content and instructional leadership are reviewed and critiqued. And think aloud research methods are presented as a means of reducing the limitations of previous research methods that have been used to explore the relationship between administrators and mathematics instruction. So I'm going to just give an overview, a short overview of the mathematics education reform and some more background about content. So going down, although this study sought to examine administrators' knowledge of the standards for mathematical practice, reference to the history of mathematics reform provides insight into the shift toward a focused curriculum and the Common Core State Standards for Mathematics. Plug. When people were having an uproar, for those of us who actually studied curriculum and instruction and reform, it was kind of mind-blowing and baffling at times to where people thought, now it probably was used out of context, but the reason behind the push and why this happened, people forgot why we needed a more focused curriculum, because students in the United States, students were coming from the north, south, east, and west. People moved all the time, but then you may have been ahead in New York, but then when you came to South Carolina, you were considered behind. Or if you were in South Carolina, and let's say you moved out to California, you were like, wait a minute, what am I supposed to be learning here? So that really was the overall reason behind having a more focused curriculum. So though the content of the standards of the Common Core have not been emphasized, it is important to understand that content and process should not be separated when teaching and learning mathematics. And that research has gone all the way back from like 2010 and 2014. Mathematics education has undergone several reforms over the past 55 years. And that was 55 years at the time of the study. So we can say 65 to 70 years at this point. The new math in the 1960s and 70s emphasized the use of language and properties, proof and abstraction, but failed to incorporate broader concepts of mathematics and failed to increase student achievement. In the late 1970s and 1980s, arithmetic computation and rote memorization of algorithms and facts were emphasized in the back to basics movements. This quickly shifted the critical thinking by 1989 when the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics produced a document with 13 curriculum standards that place reasoning at the center of learning mathematics. During the 1990s, mathematics reform included an emphasis on teaching pedagogy with various learning theory approaches to help students understand mathematics, standards for teaching mathematics, and standards to assess mathematics. And those documents were written by NCTM in 1991 and 1995. As a sequel to its 1989 Curriculum and Evaluation Standards document, NCTM continued its focus on the quality of mathematics instruction and produced a document that described the standards and expectations for each grade level centered around 5 content standards. The content strands: number and operations, algebra, geometry, measurement, and data analysis and probability. High quality mathematics standards from various states of the work by NCTM served as the foundation for the Common Core State Standards for Mathematics. Again, that was just some background to know, to show that the Common Core was not this new thing that people pulled out of the sky. The Common Core State Standards for Mathematics was built on existing standards and research and emphasized the skills and knowledge that were thought to be necessary for college and career readiness. Over a decade of research in mathematics at the time of this study, in education in the United States and other countries has launched nationwide attention to how mathematics instruction is delivered and valued in the classroom. The new standards address the connotation that curricula in the United States lacks depth by highlighting three key shifts within mathematics, which is focus, rigor, and coherence. Now, we can argue that maybe some people have taken these out of context or to the extreme, but that's neither here nor there. The shift in the focus of new standards addressed a mile-wide, inch-deep curriculum by asking students to narrow and deepen what they teach. Coherence refers to connecting learning across and within grade levels, and rigor is comprised of conceptual understanding, procedural skills and fluency, and application. It was the hope of the writers of the Common Core State Standards for Mathematics that these shifts would strengthen students' foundation in mathematics and prepare them to be productive citizens in society. While building upon the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics past work from 1989, 1991, 1995, 2000, and 2006, and addressing avenues to prepare students to master the content through processes, proficiencies, and practices, the Common Core State Standards for Mathematics has resulted in progress in narrowing the curriculum in K-12, in kindergarten through grade 8, my apologies, in 11 domain areas. This is important because this is a foundation that people tend to overlook as it relates to this now huge emphasis on understanding STEM education and leading into STEM professions. So counting and cardinality, operations and algebraic thinking, numbers and operations in base 10, numbers and operations and fractions, measurement and data, geometry, the number system, expressions and equations and functions, and statistics and probability. People can argue like, what's the point of learning certain things? But I will say it's not so much of, the basic skills that, most students are learning. It is the overall purpose and the approach to understanding these foundations of mathematical thinking that will build upon everything else as it relates to STEM education. So the need for a clear definition of mathematical proficiency and what topics students should learn was necessary to determine what is commonly considered to be sufficient mathematics at each grade level. With new and more rigorous Common Core State Standards, students have been challenged to think more deeply about mathematics and how concepts relate to the real world. Now, those are for the students, so imagine what is needed for the teachers and for the leaders. Now, all of that was mathematics reform. My apologies. All right, so the process standards. So in addition to developing the 5 content strands, NCTM presented 5 process standards, which were problem solving, reasoning and proof, communication, connections, and representation that describe the approach to understanding the content standards. So thinking mathematically, in 1980, NCTM published an Agenda for Action, a list of 8 recommendations for school mathematics, suggesting problem solving be the focus of school mathematics. I find that very interesting, seeing as how the one main component of STEM education, which people really should think of it as like an engineering design process, if you want to think about it, not necessarily becoming engineers, but the design process of that, is problem solving and how students are thinking. And if you think about it, all of this can relate to the real world if you stop focusing on just only adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. So the 1980s recommendation to incorporate problem solving in school mathematics caused a shift toward understanding how students thought about mathematics. So the mathematical proficiency, the strands and definition. So conceptual understanding, the definition is knowing mathematics beyond isolated facts. procedural fluency, knowing when and how to use algorithms in basic computation, strategic competence, understanding the process of solving mathematical problems, adaptive reasoning, the ability to think logically about mathematical situations, and productive disposition, the ability to use previously learned concepts to make sense of mathematical problems. And that was adapted from the National Research Council in 2001. So with all of that in mind, you have to think about mathematical habits and processes. Just like we have habits and things in our everyday lives that we want to change, we have to change our habits. The same thing is with the mathematics and then incorporating or inserting STEM education as a whole. So mathematical practices and mathematical habits of mind are built upon the foundation of the 5 strands of mathematical proficiency, which I said before: adaptive reasoning, strategic competence, conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and productive disposition. So the Common Core states, let me go back. The concern among mathematics educators involve the discrepancy as to why some students become mathematically proficient while others do not. And this has been a research concern as early as 1996. So focusing on mathematical practices leads to the investigation of the social and cognitive process through which students interact with mathematics. So I'm going to talk about the Common Core states. Let me go back one. So I'm going to talk about the Common Core standards for mathematical practice a little bit, and then further into this series, well, this particular section, I'll explain what those are. So for the, and we're still talking about mathematical habits and processes. So the standards for mathematical practices, or the SMPs, if you hear me say that moving forward, are student-centered, which suggests that students are responsible for obtaining new knowledge. And although the Common Core State Standards came around about 2010, just understanding students' thinking and habits, that research was around as early as 2000. I mean, it's been before that, but research as far as the new knowledge and how students process as early as 2000. The SMPs outline specific characteristics that educators should be familiar with and what educators should work towards cultivating in students to develop a comprehension of mathematical concepts, operations, and relations, skills in carrying out procedures flexibly, accurately, efficiently, and appropriately, and have an habitual inclination to see mathematics as sensible, useful, and worthwhile. It was never meant to be what people have displayed the standards to be. So how does this relate, the process standards, how do they relate to the standards for mathematical practice? Here's an overview, and then I will give the definition for the SMPs shortly. So the standards for mathematical practice, the first one, so we'll name it SMP 1, make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. That relates to the process standards of problem solving. SMP 2, reason abstractly and quantitatively. That relates to the process standards of reasoning and proof. SMP 3, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. That relates to process standards of reasoning and proof and communication. SMP 4, model with mathematics. That relates to the process standards of connection. SMP 5, use appropriate tools strategically. That relates to the process standards of representation. SMP 6, attend to precision. That relates to process standards of communication. SMP 7, look for and make use of structure. That relates to the process standard of connections and representation. And finally, SMP 8, look for and express regularity and repeated reasoning. That relates to the process standard of reasoning and proof. So now we're going to talk about how does this relate to the instructional leadership literature. So in this particular part of the study, I reviewed and critiqued the research and scholarship of administrators' interactions with mathematics instruction. Although studies in educational leadership have been conducted to examine principal leadership qualities, administrators' influence on school improvement, and how teachers, perceived school-based leaders. These studies have not directly addressed administrators' lack of attention to students' mathematical behaviors or their cognition during classroom observations. I want to go ahead and say that there's nothing wrong with those parts, but those are not the components that will necessarily move a school or a district or a curriculum forward. As such, this literature review provides additional insight into the methodological limitations of the educational research literature and suggests think aloud protocols as a viable alternative, which I'll discuss later. The analytical focus on administrators' leadership content knowledge and their background knowledge provides another insight. And that came from researchers who, mainly Nelson and Sassi from 1998 to 2010. So as we talk more about instructional leadership in mathematics, and again, you can insert any content area, but I want you to understand the foundation of the mathematics, the relationship with mathematics knowledge. To understand administrators' roles as instructional leaders and their influence on student learning, I situated a representative sample of studies into 3 of the 4 categories developed by Stein and Spillane from 2005 and extended by Stewart and Olson in 2010. The categories that Stein and Spillane's broad description of how leadership practices are connected to student achievement are linking educational practice and student outcome, mediational paradigms, learning in a social and interactive context, and research on the thinking process of researchers and educational leaders. The category of mediational paradigms, which involves schools' missions, organizational structures, and the policy demands of administrators during their daily tasks, will not be discussed as the present study focus only on the leadership practices that directly relate to student achievement. Situating a representative sample of the educational leadership literature in these 3 categories provides a foundation for the importance of administrators having an understanding of curriculum and content and the rationale to include student thinking and learning into their focus during classroom instruction. Again, I'm taking you through this background because it is important to know that whenever any consultant or new tool or system comes into your school, your building, or in the district, or even at the collegiate level, it's important to know that there is a reason why that particular thing was introduced or developed. And it's not like an attack on anyone. And sometimes, like during my own personal work, some people have felt attacked, like, when help is being brought to them. But if you understand the background, is really not your fault. That's really what I'm really trying to say, is how you were trained and developed if you went the route of being an educational leader or in the traditional teacher preparation route. So the first category, instructional leaders' influence on learning, and I'll just give a brief overview of this. The literature in education leadership field has demonstrated that administrators have either a direct or indirect influence on student outcomes. Studies in this category have been conducted to examine how administrators influence student achievement. And some of those studies, I won't read through them, have been Dumaine, Boonen, and Van Dam in 2013. And they worked with over 1,900 students and 2,600 teachers. Some other ones were from the Mid-Content Research and Educational Learning Center in 2003. And they worked over a 30-year time frame at the time of this study, and they focused on 21 specific leadership responsibilities. And some of those researchers are Waters, Marzano, and McNulty from 2003 and 2005. And then the Mid-Content Research and Educational Learning Center also worked with over 2,800 schools with 14,000 teachers and over close to 1 million students. So again, this is not something that just came out of the sky. People have put time and effort into understanding some of these components. So the second part, learning in a social and interactive context. The second category of research was used to examine how administrators' interactions with their colleagues influence student learning and classroom instruction. Some of that research came from Bartholomew, Melendez, Orta, and White in 2005. So we know that there are principal mentorship groups, there are leadership think tanks and things like that. But if you have to think about what is being discussed in those situations, and are different perspectives being honored, are people different experiences being brought in, because how you think and how you move forward is really based on your social interactive actions, especially with your colleagues. And the third one, cognitive frames. The final category of cognitive frames permits the examination of the thought processes of administrators as they interact with faculty, make instructional decisions, and evaluate and provide feedback to teachers. Cognitive frames focus on the administrator's mental and intellectual perspectives of their actions, and that was based on a 2010 study, but more research has gone all the way back at least to 1994 in this area. So all of that to say is, what was the point? So if you listen to part one, that gave a lot of background and the reason why this was important. And then for what we just talked about, or what you just listened to, was a background on the mathematics reform and then instructional leadership preparation, a small overview of that. Now it's putting it all together into how I thought about this study and why I think it's important to move forward, especially as we continue to make this push for STEM education, leading into more STEM careers. And notice you may hear me say college and career readiness, but based on my experiences, there are different pathways to that, but most of the foundation does begin with K-12 as far as with students. For our leaders, that can be non-traditional, and then people are, like I said in part one, everyone's not going back to college, to get additional degrees, especially if you've been out for a while. So there are alternative ways to get this training. So the conceptual framework provides a rationale for the analysis of data. So for this study, I used the lens of knowledge of students and content, leadership content knowledge, and noticing. The standards for mathematical practices are presented to provide real-world and classroom-based examples for how the conceptual framework was used in the resulting analysis. So an overview of each of the categories. Knowledge of content and students is a small portion of what is needed for mathematics knowledge and teaching, and the heavy hitters in this research area are Ball and Hill. And I had the pleasure of meeting Deborah Ball, and I think she was a dean at the University of Michigan, but her research in this area really shifted to the mathematics education field. To understand the significance of knowledge and content and students, it is important to briefly discuss this evolution, beginning with Schumann's pedagogical knowledge. Now, I won't read everything about that, but pedagogical knowledge, actually, I'll read one part of it. And Schumann's pedagogical knowledge really transformed how people were thinking, teaching, and learning. And that started back in his work in 1986. So as a component of what is needed for general knowledge of instructional methods, pedagogical knowledge refers to the deep understanding of the processes and practices of teaching and learning, such as lesson planning, classroom management, and the overall learning environment. Realizing that there is more to teaching than general practices, Schuman presented the notion of pedagogical content knowledge, which is the intersection of what a teacher needs to know and understand about their specific content and how to transfer and organize such knowledge for student comprehension. More specifically, pedagogical content knowledge has been defined as an understanding of what makes the learning of specific topics easy or difficult, the conceptions and preconceptions that students of different ages and backgrounds bring with them to the learning of the most frequently taught topics. And I also believe that this is true for leadership development and preparation and training. So there are different components of that. I won't go into those specifically for this series, but it is worth mentioning. And if you have the time, it's worth studying as well. So more about the knowledge of content in students. Hill in 2005 defined KCS as content knowledge intertwined with knowledge of how students think about, know, or learn this particular content. CKS is used when teachers attend to specific tasks or elements of a concept and combine that knowledge with a particular learning style or something specific about students that may help them understand what is being taught. Hill, in 2005, when they did this study, provided the example to illustrate the idea. In teaching students to add fractions, a teacher might be aware that students who often have difficulty with the multiplicative nature of fractions are likely to add the numerators and denominators of two fractions. Such knowledge might help him or her design instruction to address this likely issue, meaning the teachers really need to know their stuff and not just how to do it. Although KCS was developed through empirical research with teachers, it provides a framework that is relevant to the knowledge that should be a focus for administrators as well. The second part of the framework was leadership. The conceptual framework was leadership content knowledge. Although researchers have explored teacher content knowledge and subject matter knowledge from at least 2004 from Hill, Ball, and Schilling, a relatively small number of them have studied the knowledge base needed for administrators to identify and support teachers' knowledge of content, pedagogy, and curriculum. Administrators are responsible for supporting teachers and students, and they bring a level of knowledge from their leadership training that influence how their support is implemented. That is more to say that there's not to throw away anything that the leaders are learning as they're going through their training and preparation. However, it's not enough, and there needs to be more added to that curriculum or to the way that they're being trained and developed. It's important to know that leadership content knowledge, or LCK, you may hear me say moving forward, in mathematics does not suggest that administrators become mathematics experts or any content experts in order to effectively observe and evaluate teachers. Instead, LCK brings awareness to administrators about what they should hear and see from both the student and teachers, and how those dialogues should be used to guide instruction. Moving on to the third part of the conceptual framework is noticing. So the effect administrators have on student achievement has been found to be second only to the impact of instruction provided by the classroom teacher. Administrators influence student achievement through performing classroom observations, making instructional decisions, and providing feedback to their teachers. As instructional leaders, administrators are responsible for observing and evaluating teaching and learning through classroom observations. Administrators often gather teacher performance and student achievement data from assessment results and what they notice during classroom observations. What an administrator notices provide information beyond pencil and paper or computer-based assessments. Relating noticing across disciplines provides additional support for exploring administrators' observation processes of classroom instruction more deeply. The term expert noticing emerged from a qualitative research study of 22 K-12 reading teachers and 7 university faculty members while observing 3 videotape literacy lessons. Experts are defined as individuals who have a deep understanding of their subject matter, are able to formulate reasoned interpretation of events, and notice meaningful patterns that are not visible to others. So I wanted to share that part to know that this is across contents and disciplines. And I know it may sound like a contradiction between you don't have to be a content expert, but then to be a noticing expert. And I can just speak because I know the results of this study is expert noticing. You don't have to be an expert fully in the discipline. So for example, you don't have to have all of these degrees in mathematics to be able to be an expert in noticing what is happening during a mathematics instruction. You just have to know enough about what is being taught, what is being said, and how to identify patterns as it relates to the content. And if you don't know that, that's a skill that can be taught. So applying the construct of expert noticing to instructional leadership, Johnson in a 2011 study viewed principals as experts and explored what they noticed about classroom instruction in high-performing urban elementary, middle, and high schools. A total of 14 principals were purposely selected and interviewed using a standardized open-ended protocol, which is a type of structured interview format. The researchers asked two primary questions. Explain what you noticed when you conducted classroom observations. What do you look for during formal and informal observations? The principles attended to student engagement, learning, and understanding, classroom, climate, tone, and atmosphere, and teacher actions. The principles in this study prioritize student engagement and learning and saw teacher actions as a byproduct of what occurred during instruction. Expert noticing requires individuals to have an understanding of the content that extends beyond subject matter knowledge. Research involving administrators and what is noticed from their perspectives, particularly in mathematics, has been limited. This model framed the focus of the study. There exists some relationship between leadership content knowledge and knowledge of content in students, which influence what is noticed during classroom observations. In this case, what it means for students to engage in the standards for mathematical practice. Now, all that is saying is what is really happening based off the protocol that an administrator has when they go into the classroom, and how does that compare to what they actually see and notice? Because sometimes the protocol dictates what the focus should be on and not necessarily what the administrator or the leader actually saw. So like I said before, I would go through and tell you, give you an overview of the standards for mathematical practices. They go very deep, but I'll just give you the description of all of them. So standard for mathematical practice 1, make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. That is, mathematically proficient students start by explaining to themselves the meaning of a problem and look for entry points to its solution. Mathematical practice number 2, reason abstractly and quantitatively, relates to the reasoning and proof standard. Mathematically proficient students make sense of quantities and their relationship in problem situations. Practice number 3, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. I said it was connected to the reasoning and proof and communication process standards. The definition: mathematically proficient students understand and use stated assumptions, definitions, and previously established results in constructing arguments. Practice 4, model with mathematics, is related to the connections process standard. Mathematically proficient students can apply the mathematics they know to solve problems arising in everyday life, society, and the workplace. Mathematical practice 5, use appropriate tools strategically, is connected to the representation process standards. By definition, mathematically proficient students consider the available tools when solving a mathematical problem. Practice number 6, attend to precision, is connected to the communications process standard, and it is defined as mathematically proficient students try to communicate precisely to others. They try to use clear definitions in discussions with others and in their own reasoning. Practice 7, look for and make use of structure, relates to both the connections and representations process standards, and is defined as mathematically proficient students look closely to discern a pattern or a structure. They can see complicated things as single objects or as being composed of several objects. And the final practice, number 8, look for and express regularity in repeated reasoning, is connected to the reasoning and proof process standard. It is defined as mathematically proficient students notice if calculations are repeated, and look both for general methods and for shortcuts. So that was an overview of the standards for mathematical practice. And as you will see, this really doesn't say that a student needs to know fractions or a student needs to be able to add or which method they multiply. Is really about how are they approaching the situations or the problems. The same needs to be for the teachers as well. So who do you think teaches the students how to do that? The teacher does. And who do you think is in charge of making sure that the teacher is teaching at that high quality level? The leader is, or the administrator is. So that means they also need to have an understanding of what this looks like in a classroom. So briefly talking about classroom observations and why this is important. And some people have their gripe about classroom observations, but if you think about any profession in the world, everyone is being observed and evaluated. I just think it gets a bad rap in the education profession because it is usually tied to money, right? So classroom observations provide data for administrators to make decisions about classroom instruction. There are a variety of policies and protocols describing what administrators should look for, how often they should visit classrooms, and how they should use this data to support teachers and students. And there's actually an outline for the Florida Department of Education, and I'm sure that every state Department of Education and across the country in any education institution, they have these protocols. I just don't think everyone pays attention to them, right? So in order for administrators to effectively support mathematics teachers, they must view the classroom through a more content and student-centered lens. And that's based on research from Nelson and Sassi from 1998 all the way to 2005. Classroom observations provide information that is crucial to improving student learning. And classroom observations may include formal and informal observations and classroom walkthroughs, which are brief impromptu visits. Some people don't like those. They think they should always know an administrator is coming. I can see both sides to that. Most administrators use checklists with predetermined look-fors describing teacher questioning techniques, teacher moves, and the classroom environment, which is also includes ensuring that equity is presented during instruction. And those came from several researchers, including the heavy hitters with the teacher evaluation models and Charlotte Danielson and Robert Marzano. There's more to that, but I won't get too deep into that for this series. Just a lot of research behind what should happen in classroom observations. And the reason why research is important, because again, this is not from people sitting around thinking about what should happen, what may happen, what they think happened. These people, true researchers, actually go out and interact with human beings and observe them over a period of time. They may go in with a particular thought or a question, just like I approached this study. However, you don't know the answer until you get live feedback. So when people take bits and pieces from research, because what happens is research happens and then somebody goes conceptualize that research or make it into a system, and then someone takes it and runs with it. There's nothing wrong with that, because you don't always want to bring in all this research. You want to get down to the practical side, which is important. However, you can't leave out what got to the practical side. And I think that it happens a lot, especially in the education profession, whether it's in the classroom level or at the leadership level, and leadership goes all the way up to the top. You know, it's just a lot of cherry picking and not really understanding why we do the things we do, or why is this a recommendation. So I'll get off of that and move to the think aloud. I'll talk more about that in the next part of the series. But one approach to this, instead of looking at a predetermined protocol, is what is happening by the time from the eyes to the mouth to the hand to the paper. And is a disconnect somewhere between the eyes and the final result. So utilizing the think aloud, I'll give like a small overview. So to overcome the limitations of methods used in psychology research, the think aloud verbal protocols were used in a systematic way to document administrators' thinking to understand as they observed mathematics classroom. And this was from Erickson and Simon back in 1993. Again, I'm sharing dates for certain things to let you know that things aren't as new as people project them to be or claim them to be, right? Things aren't that new. There's a lot of research and study behind a lot of these things. Overcoming prior research limitations while maintaining the methodical way to document administrators' thinking was important to understanding how administrators' knowledge of instructional leadership, content, and students influence what they notice while observing classroom videos. Think aloud protocols enable administrators to share their thoughts while engaged in watching the classroom videos of mathematics lessons. With this technique, administrators share their thought processes, leaving less room for researcher bias than with the use of only surveys and assessments. Examining the administrator's cognition provides insight into how administrators make decisions concerning teacher observations. Think aloud research methods may not be similar to all educational researchers. However, these methods have been used in psychology and many related fields for decades, going back to DeGraw in 1965, Dunker in 1945, Newell, Shaw, and Simon in 1958, and Newell and Simon in 1956. So that was just an overview of the protocol. In the next series, I will probably talk more in depth of the process behind that. And then this may end up just being a 4-part or maybe a 5-part series, depending on what is needed to share to finally get into the practical side of how we're going to up-level the leadership, training, and development. So my whole shift is lead for ultimate impact, or one part of the movement is lead for ultimate impact and influence. You can reach out to me and connect with me on all social media platforms at Dr. Vernita Glenn White. You can visit my website, drvernitaglenn-white.com/leadership. And it's really about going through this process and going through this framework to build more STEM capacity in our leaders. Now, I will say this, there is a personal development side to this. And I think that is also a missing piece. So not only are we missing how we're training and preparing leaders to have a more, I guess, understanding of what it takes for STEM leadership. And I'm using STEM loosely because it's bigger than what is being presented now. But there's also a personal side, and I'll just do a quick bit and then I'll let you go. If you get to the root of it, a lot of people avoid anything in the hard sciences because of their own personal experiences. A lot of people move out of the classroom quickly because of their experiences or limited experiences, or their unwillingness to stay and develop a craft. Some people have mathematics anxiety. Some people have their own thoughts about science and what should be taught and what shouldn't be taught. And it really is a fear of not knowing. And then it's a belief thing. It's like, do you believe that students can learn? Do you believe that you can learn? Do you believe in your capacity to lead in a subject matter where you have been afraid of? So I won't get too much into that, but that is why I talk about the need to have personal development and professional development, because we can learn as many skills as we want. We can learn as many theories as we want. But the true change comes from the implementation. And if you're not implementing, it's something in your personal space that's blocking you from doing that, right? So when you get into something like the hard sciences, mathematics, science, understanding technology, and oh my gosh, the fear that came out during the global pandemic when more people had to shift in understanding technology, is the fear, the personal fear that came about during that time. And then I already said about mathematics, but having people to step out of their comfort zone, that's a personal thing. And that's something that we have to address that we don't really address in a lot of areas, especially in this training and development industry, as far as leadership training, even in teacher preparation. When I was teaching at the collegiate level, that we had to talk about some beliefs and things like that, and personal beliefs and some anxiety and things like that. So I'm not talking to the point where we need to include therapists, although that may need to happen in certain cases, but really uncovering what are those personal blocks that make you so afraid of technological advancement or even simple mathematics. All right, so that's all I have for you for this part. I would love to hear your thoughts of anything, whether you agree or disagree. That's how conversations and dialogue get started. I appreciate you for taking the time, and remember to be well. If I didn't say this in our first series, but I do like to end with the tagline of remembering to be well, be empowered, be bold, and be brilliant. So until next time, bye.